So far we have about 75 people joining, so it's set up to be a really great conversation. So I'm taking a look at the clock, and I know that we have a lot of RSVPs and people are still joining, but I'm actually going to get us started because what we really want to do is make sense of this crazy world together. So let me do that. Well, for starters, I will introduce myself. I'm Jessica Stern, the Executive Director of Outright Action International, and on behalf of everyone at Outright, I want to thank you for joining today's conversation, the impact of the US presidential election on LGBTIQ and human rights around the world. So just to share a couple of housekeeping notes, again, please introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your pronouns, your affiliation, and where you're based. We love seeing so many friends join us. If you have a specific question for the panel, just sort of slide over to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. That way we'll be sure to see the questions as they come in, and we'll either answer them through writing or we'll answer them verbally. The basic agenda for this call is we're going to talk for an hour. We're going to hear from our extraordinary panelists in a little bit of an interactive dialogue, and then at the end we'll have a Q&A period. But you don't have to wait for the end to enter your questions. Just as when someone says something and it inspires you, drop us a question and we'll do our best to answer it in real time. This webinar is being recorded. A lot of people wanted to see the conversation today, but just so you know, the webinar will only record the panelists and the moderator. So you don't have to worry if you're wearing your pajamas or if you have issues of confidentiality, you will not be recorded by virtue of watching this. So I know that some of you are longtime colleagues, supporters, and partners of Outright, and some of you are tuning in for the first time. And just for those of you who are new, I want to very quickly share our mission with you. So this year, Outright is celebrating our 30th anniversary of protecting and advancing human rights for LGBTIQ people around the world. We have staff in 7 countries globally, and our programs include conducting groundbreaking research on issues impacting LGBTIQ people, resourcing grassroots LGBTIQ movements around the world through trainings and convenings and grants, and we hold governments accountable at the United Nations and beyond. And what's especially relevant to this conversation is Outright also works to hold the world's most powerful governments accountable, which means Outright also targets advocacy at the United States. Today's conversation is part of a learning series that Outright is hosting called Out Talks. And through Out Talks, we host a conversation more or less each week about issues of importance for LGBTIQ people globally. And we feature Outright staff and leading LGBTIQ rights thinkers, activists, and allies from around the world. So I'm very pleased to have an extraordinary set of such thinkers, activists, and allies with us today. So now that I've dispensed with the housekeeping, let me do something that I'm excited about, which is to introduce our panel. Today we have Sharita Gruberg with us. Sharita is the Senior Director for the LGBTQ Research and Communications Project at the Center for American Progress. And in that role, she leads the organization's work advancing LGBTQ equality and combating discrimination. And we're going to be placing the full bios for everyone in the chat box so you can see just the extent of our colleagues' work. As the Executive Director of Immigration Equality, Erin Morris is heavily involved in the organization's legal services, impact litigation, policy initiatives, and lobbying efforts. In addition to his work in national LGBTQ human rights, he is co-counsel on several federal court discrimination cases for same-sex families. Welcome, Erin. Welcome, Sharita. And last but not least, we have Mark Bromley. Mark is the chair of the Council for Global Equality, an organization he helped launch to encourage a clearer American voice on international LGBT and intersex human rights concerns. Mark provides regular briefings on trends impacting LGBT individuals globally. I have to do that hard thing where I'm toggling between Microsoft Word and the screen, but I can now see that we have over 100 people who've joined us. So welcome to you all. And I just want to repeat, if you've just joined us, please introduce yourself in the chat. We're so happy to have everyone here. So a couple of reflections before I move into the panel. I would say that I'm probably speaking for a lot of us when I say that we received the news of the election with joy and mixed emotion. We at Outright are saddened that so many Americans voted for Donald Trump, who still refuses to respect the democratic process, though he lost by 5 million votes. And we're also saddened that the right flipped at least 9 seats in the House. It's clear that many Americans endorsed racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, the repudiation of science, voter suppression, and a disregard for the principle of collective well-being. And we know what this means. The politics of division sown by the right have been effective. These divides reflect radically different worldviews, and these divides cannot easily be mended. I think to summarize it, I would say it's not like Biden is president so we can all take a break. We have a lot of work ahead. And still, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won, and we are celebrating. In fact, I'm wearing suffragette white because Kamala Harris is the first woman vice president. She's the first Black vice president. She's the first Asian vice president. And she's the first generation vice president. And Joe Biden, our president-elect, has endorsed many liberal issues that are most important to LGBTIQ rights globally and has an absolutely stellar team around him that believes in championing human rights. So over the next 4 years, we expect that we will dismantle the most egregious offenses of the past 4 years, rebuild, and in as many places as possible, move the needle forward for LGBTIQ rights. And the question that I think is circling around all of us is, what do we want and what can we achieve and how do we get there? And I'll just cite 3 examples from Outright's own set of priorities, and then we'll hear from our panel about their vision. So from Outright, one of our primary goals is to limit the role of religious exemptions as an excuse to justify discrimination against LGBTIQ people. 2, we are fighting for the appointment and resourcing of the special envoy on LGBTI rights established under the Obama administration. And 3, and this is an issue that affects many groups and many representatives on this call, we want to see increased funding from USAID and the US State Department for LGBTIQ civil society organizations working to promote LGBTIQ rights worldwide. So if it's not clear, for the first time in 4 years, we have hope. So now I'm going to turn to our panel and ask an icebreaker, and please keep it brief, but be honest. Where were you when you got the news on Saturday of the Biden-Harris election? Let's see. Sharita, you've got bright red lipstick and eyeglasses, so my eyes are drawn to you first.
Sure. I was actually in a car going hiking in Maryland, but we rolled down the windows, blasted Nipsey Hussle's classic FDT, and had a lot of cars honking their approval and joy as we drove. So it was a good feeling.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sharita. Aaron, my fellow Brooklynite, what was your Saturday like?
So I was just sitting on my couch listening to NPR, but it was a taped show, so it wasn't live news. And everyone in my neighborhood and in my building lost their minds at the same time. And there was such a cacophony of joy that it was immediately apparent what had happened, even though I wasn't refreshing the New York Times over and over like a lot of people. And it was so celebratory in a way, and it was so universal that I just thought this must be what like VE Day felt like. It was just everywhere all the time, and people poured in the streets, and it was really beautiful to see.
Thanks, Aaron. Mark?
Yeah, so I was about to go to Target with my 2 kids who had been bugging me to go to Target. And we got the news, and I told them, and they had been asking me nonstop for days, is it decided yet? Who's going to win? Who's going to win? They are 7 and 10, and they don't like suspense, nor did I at that point. So they were overjoyed, and we took a turn from Target and headed to Black Lives Matter Plaza in downtown DC, right in front of the White House. And we joined the celebration. It was amazing.
Beautiful. I think that a lot of us can relate to the feeling your kids have. We were not good with the suspense. So Mark, I'm going to ask you the first question. This week, the Council for Global Equality, your organization, issued a 51-page document that amounts to a set of transition recommendations to the Biden-Harris team. You direct recommendations at 9 government bureaus, and you suggest that there should be an executive order for LGBTIQ rights. And I just want to say, as a colleague of yours and as a friend, it is an absolutely masterful piece of work, and we're very grateful that you put it together. And I'll also say, I feel like you are still human enough to be a friend, because I know you've been working on it since 2016. This is not something you threw together since Saturday. So it's immense. We put it in the chat box. Please, everyone, take a look at it if you haven't seen it yet. Mark, my question for you is, walk us through it. What damage must the Biden administration undo, and what is your vision for progress?
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, no, and it has been 4 years in the making, so that explains the 51 pages. And we also have detailed recommendations for each of the foreign affairs agencies. So you know, the overriding thrust of it is sort of what should come out of the White House and the National Security Council, and what should the State Department be doing to repair the damage of the past 4 years. But there are also targeted recommendations for the Treasury Department, which is the liaison to the World Bank and the international financial institutions, to the Commerce Department, to the Defense Department, which you know, we all know, for better or for worse, is a major foreign policy actor. So there's recommendations for all, but let me just highlight some of the themes, and particularly looking at the White House and the State Department. You know, I think the first issue is to get back to where we were at the end of the Obama administration 4 years ago. So as many of you will remember, in 2011, President Obama issued a presidential memorandum, which for the first time instructed all of the foreign affairs agencies to look at their programs, their funding, their diplomatic engagement, and use those tools to leverage support for the LGBTI community globally. And they had to report annually to the White House. That was important. So they had to report every year and tell the president what they were doing to implement that memorandum. We are asking the Biden administration to basically take that memorandum as a framework and upgrade it to an executive order, which in terms of administrative law is a higher, you know, it's a higher order, right? It's harder for departments to ignore it. I have to admit, even under the Obama administration, the Defense Department was not particularly eager to implement the memorandum. So an executive order would be harder for, say, the Defense Department to ignore. So we're asking for an executive order within the first week of the presidency. Admittedly, there's a lot that President Biden will have to do in the first week, but we think this should be a priority. And what the memorandum, it would first of all instruct all of the agencies, again, to do a review of all their funding, their programs, their engagement, to look for ways to support LGBTI groups and individuals globally. But it would also sort of take the first steps of repairing, rejoining, repealing the bad steps of the past 4 years, right? So look at ways to sort of immediately rejoin the World Health Organization, to re-engage at the United Nations, at the OAS, and in other multilateral institutions, to restore leadership within the core groups, which are the groups of like-minded countries at the UN, at the OAS, the Equal Rights Coalition. So really, you know, re-engage in multilateral diplomacy in a way that we haven't in the past 4 years. In fact, that we've been undermining these institutions quite seriously over the past 4 years. Then at the US level, at the Washington level, we are calling for the appointment of a special envoy for the human rights of LGBTI persons. That was a position that was created under the Obama administration as a senior level diplomat at the State Department, whose job it was to to work with other countries to promote LGBTI rights. That position wasn't formally eliminated in the organogram of the State Department, but the Trump administration, not surprisingly, never appointed anyone to that position. So we think that's important, and we think it should be upgraded to an ambassadorial level. There's some immediate things that can be done to sort of revitalize the Human Rights Bureau within the State Department. In particular, right sizing, we call it, or integrating the religious freedom work that the State Department has been doing. So to really integrate that in a broader sense with all of the human rights programs. And that actually quite literally means taking the Office of International Religious Freedom, which right now is an office that sits next to the Secretary of State, and bringing it back into the Human Rights Bureau within the State Department. And that's a very bureaucratic request, but it's actually really important in terms of integrating programming and funding and priorities. So the document has a lot of those sort of bureaucratic tweaks, but really overall, it's about repairing, rebuilding, rejoining, getting us back to where we were at the end of the Obama administration, and then looking at how we build from there. Another big part of it is going to be funding. So fortunately, and largely because of a democratically controlled appropriations committee in the House of Representatives, there has been ongoing funding for LGBTI work globally from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and the State Department. This year, fiscal year 21, it looks like the budget will be about $6 million from USAID for global LGBTI work, and $10 million for the Global Equality Fund at the State Department, which is a basket fund that the U.S. State Department administers. Other countries contribute to it to fund LGBTI work. So 6 million USAID, 10 million State Department, that's about 16 million. We are calling for the Biden administration in its first budget, so this would be fiscal year 22, to increase that to at least 30 million each for State Department and USAID. That is what both USAID and State Department say they need in terms of just meeting their funding requests at a level that is equal to other categories of issues, right? So in terms of being able to fund the same percentage of qualified proposals that they get for religious freedom work or disability rights work or women's rights work, to be able to fund proportionally to the solid requests they get, and in parity with these other issues, they need at least 30 million each at state and USAID. So we're calling for that pretty quickly. And then once we get there, hopefully in the first year, we'll look at how do we go beyond where we were at the end of the Obama administration. And I think there are some real opportunities, although those opportunities are going to depend quite substantially on what Congress looks like, and particularly whether the Democrats control the Senate or not. And as we all know, we're not going to know that until January with the 2 runoff elections in Georgia. So that's my quick summary of a 51-page document that's been 4 years in the making.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to go next to Sharita, but Mark, one thing that I think would be useful for people to hear from you, and maybe you could put this in the chat, is maybe you could include some of the funding levels for other categories of human rights issues, just so people understand you're not making these numbers up. You're actually just asking for parity. So if you have that information and can put it in the chat, great, or else we'll try to circle back to you in the next rounds. All right, Sharita. I want to be as pragmatic as possible. And so as of now, for the sake of my own sanity, I'm making all the donations I possibly can to the wonderful state of Georgia. And I'm also trying to plot a path forward based on the assumption that the Senate will remain in Republican hands. I think that's, a sort of survival strategy that feels realistic to me. And I think that's important because what happens with the Senate is going to impact who can make it through the Senate confirmation process. It's going to impact the courts. And you said to me, I'm going to quote you, because it was so eloquent. You said, there's a lot we can do at the agency level and with executive authority, but with 1 in 4 federal judges being a Trump appointee, every single progressive action is going to be taken to the most conservative judge our components can find in the most conservative circuit. No matter how sound the legal basis for progressive actions, we have to assume that every one of those actions will be attacked and we might lose. So this is a pretty dark reality check, and I'd love if you would expand on it.
Sure. Mitch McConnell has been a thorn in all of our sides for a while. As Mark said, if he is Senate Majority Leader, he will continue to do what he does best, and that's obstruct any action on the part of the Senate. But also, he was really efficient under Trump. And as you said, 1 in 4 federal judges are Trump appointments. And when you look at appellate judges, 30% of all appellate judges were appointed by Trump, which is really concerning when we know that our opponents are going to challenge every single thing a Biden administration tries to do, particularly for advancing equality. That said, there's a lot that's in the president's executive authority. There's a lot that agencies can do to implement the laws that Congress passed. As Mark said, this executive order is a really great opportunity for advancing progress. There's a lot of deference to presidents on executive orders. One concern, though, is a lot of that work goes to the agencies to implement through regulations. And we are prepared for every single rule advancing equality or human rights to get challenged. One of the day one things that Biden can do is re-enter the Paris agreements. That requires regulations on emissions levels. All those are going to get challenged. And so for the LGBT rights side, there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot that we should do to implement the Supreme Court's Bostock decision to expand sexual orientation and gender identity protections in any sex discrimination laws. We're in really strong grounds there. So I feel pretty confident in those, in their ability to advance equality that way. But again, it doesn't matter how strong our legal grounds are, they are going to try to challenge it, and they have their pick of judges to take these cases too. We have the most conservative Supreme Court that we have had in a really long time right now, I think since the 30s. And that's alarming. We won the Bostock decision, and it was already a conservative court in that case, so there's still hope. But it's going to be a challenge. And, going back to regulations, the way that courts have traditionally looked at this is, whenever Congress explicitly directs an agency to do something, courts tend to be deferential. And so again, as conservative as these courts are, Mark and CGE put out a really great proposal. A lot of groups are putting out really clear proposals who have a lot of expertise in the law. And so really sticking to, as much as possible, wherever the Congress was really clear in giving agencies authority to put forward these regulations, they're going to try to do those. We can't always rely on the courts to follow their own precedent here, but I think we're on really firm footing there. And so, that's all to say they're going to challenge every single action, but I do think we're going to win because we are so firm in our legal bases, and the Biden administration is really firm in the legal bases for all of the really progressive and pro-equality measures that they're planning on taking.
Thanks, Sharita. So part of what I hear you saying is, expect a lot of litigation, expect a lot of initial efforts to be challenged by the opposition. But I also hear you saying, expect that we have a good chance of winning in the end. Okay, you're reeling me back. I'm walking back from the ledge. Thank you for that. Erin, I'd love to go to you next. I have often thought how incredibly hard your job must have been these past 4 years. And I know that immigration equality does not have infinite resources for the infinite challenges that you have faced. So I just want to say, we're all sending you a lot of love and solidarity right now. And someone send this man like a gift certificate to a social distance massage, because you really deserve it. You know, anyone not from the US generally, and immigrants to the US specifically, have been scapegoated by the Trump administration for the past 4 years. And it's almost impossible to follow all of the forms of attack that have come. But of course, Trump proposed to dismantle the asylum system entirely. His administration issued 1,100 immigration policy changes. I think I'm probably summarizing accurately when I say it's been apocalyptic. And so I wanted to ask you, what are the main immigration problems that must be fixed and what can be achieved?
Well, thanks, Jessica. It has been a rough 4 years for any immigrant in America, for anyone looking to America as a beacon of hope or an opportunity to stay safe because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So I'm gonna start with good news and then sort of build to the big challenge, because with any executive order or change of policy, there are a lot of things that the Biden administration can do without Congress. You know, one lesson learned from the Trump administration is that if you're going to overturn your predecessor's policy, you have to have a reason to do so. You can't just issue an order that nullifies something without some backing to it. So if you're changing a policy that already exists, it's a bit harder. And I think one of the things that we have to make sure to support the Biden administration is making sure that they have a reasoned, thoughtful approach to undoing a lot of what Trump did, or it's going to get stuck in courts again. And we might lose, as Sharita said, we might lose in those courts if you know, it's sort of tit for tat happens. And one of those, and I'm just going to burn through a bunch of things that are all in the president's power. One of them is temporary protected status. And that is the idea that there are certain nations that have a disaster, whether it's a civil war or a hurricane or an earthquake. America understands that we can't ask someone to go back to a nation that's in a disaster time. And so we issue temporary protected status to those individuals. And on an annual basis, you know, the government reassesses whether it's still not safe. And under the Trump administration, they did that, for example, for Haiti. And the government issued its report and they said, Haiti's still not safe. We should extend to temporary protected status. And the Trump administration didn't like the answer. So they told them to go do the report again until they got to a point where they felt good about stripping all kinds of people from TPS. And I think because that's exclusively an executive branch determination, the temporary protected status program could be reinvested for a lot of other kinds of people. It still has to have a reason, right? The country still has to be in distress, but there are a lot of places where it's not safe to return someone. Another one is the Muslim ban, right? That got caught up in the Supreme Court 2 or 3 times. And in the end, the Trump administration justified its position to a sufficient degree that the court sanctified it. And I think that it would not be that difficult to come back in and say, okay, we've taken a review of this and we disagree as a matter of national security that this is necessary and that we're putting whatever protocols in place to ensure that the visa processing system is accurate and robust enough that we don't need to have these blanket bans. Something a little closer to home for what immigration equality does is the number of refugees we accept into the United States each year. Under the last year of the Obama administration, they were slated to accept 110,000 individuals. So these are people in refugee camps, designated refugees who are just looking for a country to say, I'll take them. And the Trump administration year over year whittled that down so that this year the cap was at 15,000. So from 110 to 15. And I don't think that they met that quota. So, you know, even thinking that maybe if 5% of those individuals of those refugees are LGBTI people, we could save 5,000 people over 1 year just by resettling them. DACA, of course, everybody was worried about, and it barely, I think, by a thread survived Supreme Court review. And so Biden has already indicated that he's going to renew DACA. You know, at the birth of that program, there was a lot of discussion in the Obama administration about one more step, which was called DAPA. And DAPA was to give a similar status to the Dreamer children, but to give that status to their parents as well. because having a mixed status family is really difficult. Having one person announce themselves to the US government when everybody else in the family is undocumented is complicated, and it really depressed a lot of DACA applications. But for whatever reason, and there was a lot of pushback on both of those programs, but the Obama administration did not push forward DACA. It would be interesting to see if we could get a similar program from the Biden administration, but really to stick it. And in thinking about legislative solutions, with or without a Republican Senate, I think the DREAM Act may be one of the very few legislative propositions in immigration that might actually have bipartisan legs and could pass. So I think all of us should be pushing forward with the DREAM Act. But there are two initiatives that Immigration Equality has spent years on, one of which has an easy solution for the State Department, and that is that the US government is denying that the children of same-sex couples born abroad are citizens. So that if I, as an American, am married to a French guy and we have a baby in France, the government will only deem our child, even if we're the exclusive parents since birth, the government will only deem that child to be a US citizen if I have a genetic relationship to the kid. So they're denying that the relationship of a parent to a child, they're denying recognition of the marriage of the binational couple. And in some cases, even when two US citizens have a child abroad, like two women, both of whom are US citizens, because of certain residency requirements, they're denying that their children are US citizens. And that's not in the law anywhere. It's in no statute. It's not required by Congress. This is a policy that was created by the State Department. And to be frank, it was created under the Obama administration. And we worked and we worked and we worked and we tried to get them to overturn it, and they wouldn't. And the Clinton campaign indicated that they were interested in a different policy. And when Trump became president, we had no choice but to sue. And so we won that issue in 3 different district courts now. We have a 4th case pending. And now that we have this like sanctified opinion from 3 different courts, one of which is in Georgia, like this is from a very conservative judge who was appointed by Donald Trump, that we have a lot of legs, I think, to convince the State Department to change that policy. What's much harder is asylum. And there are certain things that we could demand fairly quickly, because there's a presidential memorandum right now saying that if America deems it possible to send you to Central America, you should go there and file for asylum first. And if that doesn't work out, you can come back. But if you're fleeing from El Salvador as a transgender woman, going to Guatemala isn't any better for you. And so these third country agreements, which are currently in a presidential memorandum, should end. It's a ridiculous expectation. It shirks America's responsibility to actually adjudicate an asylum claim, and it really puts our community in danger. Similarly, the Remain in Mexico policy, where we've pushed everyone on the other side of the border into Mexican refugee camps, is terrible for all refugees or potential refugees, and especially for LGBTI people who really suffer terribly in those camps. Human Rights First put out a report that they documented during the course of Remain in Mexico that more than 1,000 people had been kidnapped, extorted, murdered, just because they were waiting to get into the United States to file for asylum. And a whole lot of those individuals are LGBTI people. And that system doesn't make any sense. It's deeply cruel, and it's antithetical to our law in the asylum context. The harder part, which will require more than just administrative advocacy, is that the Trump administration issued proposed asylum regulations that, as you say, Jessica, effectively make asylum not possible in the United States. They put so many obstacles and so many burdens on an applicant that I don't know of anyone, however sophisticated or with whatever strong a claim, I don't know of anyone that's going to win. Those regulations were issued for public comment. More than 80,000 people and institutions made comments, and the government has to go back and digest that. And then they'll spit out a response to those comments, which, as I expect, will be, we read your comments and we don't give a damn. Here are the new regulations, deal with it. And I am sure that those regulations are going to come out before the end of this administration. And the Biden administration can't just wave a magic wand to undo regulations. Regulations were a long, thoughtful, drawn-out process. These were 161 pages long, and it took the Trump administration, who was hell-bent on damaging the asylum system, 3 years to create them. And it may take the Biden administration, even if we've light a fire under them, an additional 2 or 3 years to come up with new regulations that replace them. And so we have to have a litigation strategy. Huge portions of those regulations are clearly illegal, and they do not comport with the will of Congress. And so I will commit immigration equality to bringing that lawsuit very shortly after the regulations go into effect. We'll have something like a 30 or 60-day window before they go into effect, and we have to stop them, because if we don't, literally no one will be granted asylum in the United States.
Thank you, Aaron. We're sending that gift certificate for a massage, and we're upping it.
I'll take them all. I'll take them all. Facials.
Happening. I really appreciate all of your comments, and I want to just direct folks to the chat and the Q&A for a moment. Actually, before I do that, I just want to say, I would like to hear multiple voices, but Aaron, I just want to understand, are you saying that if the regulations the Trump administration is pushing go into effect, that asylum access to the US could be effectively suspended for years? And I'll ask you to be brief, because I want to get to other speakers.
The short answer is yes. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts, so that there are so many different obstacles that a person would have to get through that it's hard to imagine any refugee being able to have the resources, the wherewithal, or the capacity to do so, especially an LGBTI person who's at the border, who may not trust the government. Like, there are all these rules that you must immediately self-disclose, you must immediately tell a judge what you want, you've got 14 days to file everything. Like, they make it so hard. Even with counsel, it'll be difficult, but most people don't have a lawyer.
Okay, thank you, Aaron, for putting that into stark relief. And I think what that underscores is something that is a value long held at Outright, which is that, you know, asylum and refugee resources and access need to exist. And also we need to do everything within our power to support the safety, security, and dignity of LGBTIQ people at home, so they don't have to leave their country. And I think that's especially important in this environment where borders, not just in the US, but of course across Fortress Europe and some of the traditional allied states as well, have been closing for years. So thank you for that. I want to go into some of the questions and comments happening in the chat window. Mark provided a really helpful answer to my question to him, indicating that if the US wanted to be on par with countries that have a strong leadership role globally for LGBTIQ rights, then actually total foreign assistance for LGBTIQ rights would need to grow from the, 16 million now, Mark, to about 90 million. So it's a huge leap forward. And by comparison, the Council for Global Equality is only asking for 60 million, which almost sounds like maybe the Council should be more ambitious, Mark. And maybe I
Agreed,
could,
but that's just the first year.
okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe that is actually a question. Why didn't you push for more? Because we know that what happens in the first year is going to set the standard for the administration for years to come.
Yeah, no, we debated that, and we do think that over the course of the Biden administration, we need to get to 90 to 100 million per year in funding. But you know, obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, an economic crisis. Funding is going to be difficult. And in speaking with both the State Department and USAID, they both say they have the capacity immediately right now to administer 30 to 35 million each. So, you know, without adding any new positions, any new infrastructure, that's what they can immediately absorb. So we just, being practical, realistic, wanted to say, okay, this is what we really need starting immediately, and then let's go up from there.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. I want to invite everyone to pose questions at this time. There's one preferred way to do it, but we'll take questions in any format. So there's a Q&A box along the bottom of the screen, and I see 2 questions have emerged. So one is from someone named Nigel Lake, who very bravely offered a question early in the conversation. So thank you, Nigel. And Nigel said, money talks, and hence both corporate activity and intergovernmental activity can exert positive or negative pressure. Where and how will the geopolitics unlocked by Biden's victory help or hinder the cause of LGBTIQ and human rights in the US and around the world. So panelists, I'm going to read out a few questions and then I'm going to ask who would like to respond. Marna Eid from FREE, the Norwegian LGBTIQ organization, is asking Mark, is that in addition to the funds from Sweden? So I assume that she's talking about your $16 million total. And then Michael Lavers, an extraordinary queer journalist that many of us know and love from DC, asked a question to Erin. Erin, can you talk about the abuses of LGBTQ ICE detainees that LGBTQ ICE detainees have suffered while in detention, especially in privately run detention centers under the Trump administration, and what immigration equality feels the Biden administration can do to address it? And Larry Helfer asks, what steps can be taken to abrogate the conclusions and recommendations of the Pompeo State Department's Commission on Unalienable Rights? So complex questions there. Sharita, I want to start with you. I want to ask if there's a question that you have seen that you'd like to answer, or if you're surprised that no one asked you more about the expansion of Bostock, because of course that was my question for you. And if you could please elaborate on it.
Oh, no problem. I will jump off of the Pompeo Commission on Unalienable Rights and go to religious exemptions, which also impacts Bostock. You know, there's a lot that the Biden administration is going to be able to do and is already committed to doing on day one to roll back the extreme expansion of exemptions and undermining the idea of religious liberty and what religious liberty in our countries and our laws are supposed to mean, to weaponize it against religious minorities as well as LGBTQ folks. I think it's really ironic that Pompeo has this commission on unalienable rights and keeps centering religious liberty over other rights in an administration that came in promising to ban Muslims from entering the country. And as a queer Muslim, my rights are never the ones that they're thinking of when they're centering religious liberty. It's always how they can use it to weaponize and harm people like me. So there's a lot on day one that the Biden administration is going to be doing to roll back these. Erin mentioned pending regulations that haven't been finalized. There's one on faith-based service providers at USAID that would eliminate protections for people seeking services from these faith-based providers, knowing their rights, knowing their ability to go to other providers for services. This proposed rule eliminates all of those safeguards for people seeking services. It's not been finalized. I imagine that's going to be on the docket of things that they try to finalize. Also, more broadly, going back to the courts and kind of Erin's characterization of how they're going to undermine rights by 1,000 cuts, LGBTQ equality is another one of those areas where the courts are really primed to kind of give us skim milk rights or second-class rights. And so, and that's through expanding religious exemptions. And so, for example, there was a court case last summer that allowed teachers at faith-based schools to be fired as an exercise of religious liberty. Now, what is the religious liberty that was in question on that case? It was the faith-based school's religious liberty to fire someone for having breast cancer. And if that is what the court is going to approve as an exercise of religious liberty, we are in trouble. There was the day after the election, the Supreme Court heard a case, Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, and kind of the crux of this case is whether faith-based organizations are entitled to a contract from the government to provide a service, and it, as part of that, can disregard things like non-discrimination laws in the provision of these services. And you know, that has really troubling implications as we are pushing for non-discrimination protections in services. The Obama administration enacted a really great rule on non-discrimination in grants through the State Department. And so, you know, these are all ways that the Biden administration is going to try to protect people. They're going to erode our protections under Bostock by saying, like, yes, you have these protections, but basically anyone who doesn't want to follow it and has a religious claim to do so is exempt. I know there's a lot of really amazing attorneys who are doing the work and fighting every single one of these to make sure that these exemptions are as limited as possible. But again, with the judiciary stacked the way it is, we are really going to see an erosion in our rights and protections, and a really expansive license to discriminate against LGBTQ folks, against religious minorities, against women, and other groups. And so, but you know, for the Pompeo Commission, Mark has a lot more to say because they have been fighting this tooth and nail throughout. But there is a whole lot we can do to roll back this kind of centering of religious liberty over other rights and undermining other rights in the foreign policy space, in the federal aid space.
Thanks so much, Sharita. Aaron, I'd love to get a comment from you, and then Mark, I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to see if there's time for like a lightning question, and then we're going to wrap up because we have about 12 minutes left. And Aaron, I just want to say, you got a bunch of questions. You got an offer for a volunteer from someone who sounds really capable.
Great.
And you also got a comment in the chat box from Paul Delane. And so I want to ask which of those comments you had a chance to think about and reply to.
Oh, I'm actually not reading comments, but I'm happy to reply to Michael and then to follow up with anybody afterward if we run out of time on detention. And so under every administration, we have been fighting against the detention of asylum seekers because it's inhumane, it's very cruel, it's remarkably exorbitantly expensive for taxpayers, and it doesn't accomplish anything other than to punish people for coming to the US to ask for help. You know, there are so many reports that if an asylum seeker is not detained, they show up for court, that it's in their best interest to go. And the government's only two policy questions are, is this person a flight risk, yes or no? And is this person a danger to the community? If the answer is no to those two questions, they don't have the right to detain anybody. But there's this huge industrial complex of private companies, private corporations making a giant profit off of detaining asylum seekers. And that's terrible for all asylum seekers, but there's a particular vulnerable portion of the population, including pregnant women, including children, like the very classical, like it's gut-wrenching to know that we're detaining refugees in this way. But LGBTQ people are among those. And we got some traction at the very end of the Obama administration about designating LGBTQ people among vulnerable populations who should be presumptively not detained, but we didn't push it through. And of course, under the Trump administration, that was a non-starter. Our good friends, Sharita Gruberg, compiled a bunch of FOIA data that showed that LGBTQ people were 99 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in detention. That's not 99% more, it's 99 times more. And there's no justification to hold our community in detention if that's the case. If the government can't house people safely, they shouldn't house them at all. And this became even more stark during COVID because we were representing a group of lesbians from Cuba in Louisiana, and the facility was rampant with COVID. And they were telling us horror stories where they had no soap for 2 weeks, let alone social distancing, and no toilet paper for the same amount of time. Like, it was unsanitary. It's not a place anyone should be ever, and especially not during a pandemic. And for one woman, we filed 4 different parole requests, and all 4 of them were denied. And they came back with the same reason. She's a flight risk. She's a flight risk. And in the end, she has asylum. She was never a flight risk. And they kept her detained for 6 months for no reason. And so there's a huge opportunity there to push for reform. I'm a little skeptical, given the money that's involved in this huge apparatus, about the liberation of all people. That is certainly should be our first ask. And then also to work from the inside to make those conditions more palatable and to make sure our population is presumptively not detainable.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And Sharita, did you just post the link to the resource that Aaron just cited?
I did one on the profit motive, and I was about to drop in the sexual assault, our findings on widespread sexual assault and the inability and kind of refusal of DHS to protect LGBTQ folks from abuse and detention.
Okay, thank you, Sharita. So Nigel, take a look at the post that Sharita is going to put in the Q&A, and you'll be able to see the answer to your question. Mark, there's a couple of questions here. There was Marna's that was addressed to you specifically. There's a question from Addison Smith from Wellspring, and Addison says, my sense is that normally many secretaries and agency heads are preserved at least for some time through a transition until new leadership can be installed or approved by the Senate, etc. I wonder about panelists' reflections on how quickly a Biden administration will or should quickly dispatch some of those heads to mitigate continued damage from their leadership. And also, if you're willing to spill the tea, that's my interjection, which of those heads would be the highest priorities to excuse? So Mark, let me give you a chance to answer that. And Aaron, there's a question from someone named Michael Kaiser about his particular situation. If you could take a look at that and try to type it in the Q&A function. And then I'll get to your questions, Ali Rashad, hello, and Catherine Hendique. So Mark, over to you.
Yeah, let me try to answer a couple of those questions. And it's so wonderful to see so many friends in the chat box. So hi to everybody. Marna's question on funding. This year that just our government year that ended in September, we think the total funding for LGBTI work, specifically for LGBTI work, will be about $12 million. That's US government money. There was additional money from Sweden and Norway and other governments that were put into that pool, but US government money was 12 million. The total pot was bigger. That pot, in terms of US government money, is projected in this fiscal year that started October 1st to probably be about 16 million. But again, so we are asking for an increase from sort of the where we're on track for 16 million to increase that to 60 million. So big increase for this year. In terms of the agency heads and the transition, it depends a little bit, I think, on which agency we're talking about. I know the State Department and USAID best, the foreign affairs agencies, and I can assure you that the Biden transition team will show Secretary Pompeo the door on the very first day of the administration. He's a hard Trump warrior, and there's no way that he will stay over. And as you may know, about a third of all U.S. ambassadors are political appointments. So they're not people who have risen through the career ranks of the State Department and then been appointed ambassador. That's about 2/3 are what we call career ambassadors, and 1/3 are political, just golfing buddies of the president. Those ambassadors, the political ambassadors, will all leave on January 20th, if not before. And I'm quite certain that the Trump administration will not ask any of them to stay. Finally, just a real quick point on the Commission on Unalienable Rights in terms of what we can do concretely to refute the work of that commission. I think it has been very harmful, and we've been fighting it every step of the way, as Sharita kindly mentioned. We have a pending lawsuit against the State Department that would, if we win, would instruct the State Department essentially to repudiate the report and would prevent the State Department from ever using or distributing the report in the future. We also are calling on the Biden administration, both the president and the Secretary of State in the new year, to repudiate the work of the commission and to appoint a new group of outside human rights experts who are actually human rights experts, actual practitioners who have worked on human rights issues around the world and in our own country, to really repudiate the report and come up with a new effort to really integrate all rights in a meaningful way into the work of the State Department.
Thanks, Mark. I've got just about 5 minutes to wrap up. So let me take a couple of questions and then I'll offer some concluding thoughts. First of all, let me just say to Ali, it's really exciting to have you here. So yay, hi. I think there so you asked, in addition to advocating for higher funding for LGBTIQ activism globally, how do you think the new administration should approach LGBTQ plus rights in other countries and governments that still criminalize the LGBTQ plus community, particularly in the Middle East? I'll start with that. And I think that links to Catherine's question about what the US government could do to help protect and help LGBTQIA plus rights in South Asia. I think there's certain guiding principles about how the US can be effective. One of the most important is by taking its lead in the struggle for LGBTIQ rights from LGBTIQ civil society working at the grassroots level. Because if the US government gets ahead of what the local community is calling for, advocating for, understands is the most appropriate strategy at a given time, it could backfire and it could create backlash. And so, governments don't always work in partnership with civil society, and governments often don't have relationships with members of civil society that are deemed in one way or another the criminalized other. But it's just absolutely essential that the US has that analysis. And I think that happens through a few different vehicles. It happens through developing relationships through the US embassies and consulates around the world. It happens through the US's steadfast effort to seek out LGBTIQ civil society when high-level dignitaries travel around the world. It happens through seeking opportunities to engage LGBTIQ civil society at the level of strategy in multilateral spaces, like the African Commission, like the OAS, like the UN. And it also means the US playing an active and robust role in multilateral mechanisms, whether it's the UN's LGBTI core group or the Equal Rights Coalition. So what I'm trying to say in that is, if the US has a pattern of practice of working with LGBTIQ civil society, it will become more effective at advancing LGBTIQ rights because it will be asking the right people. Now, the second part of Ali's question is, yeah, but how do you do that? And I would just say, the strategy is always, to tailor the approach to what fits the relevant situation. So in some places, that's going to be investing in sensitizing journalists to report on LGBTIQ rights. In other places, it's going to mean supporting the quest of civil society, LGBTIQ civil society, to legally register or to build their capacity. It just really needs to vary depending upon where the movement is itself. And I just want to emphasize that has to be the strategy with whether they're criminalizing laws on the books or not. If you can tell, I'm speaking faster and faster because I'm realizing I'm not getting through all the questions in the allotted time. But what I want to do is say, if there's anyone who asked a question and I'm not getting to it, please email us. My colleague M is on the chat. M, if you could post our general email address, there's some questions we might not get to. People can please send their follow-ups and we will promise to follow up there. What I want to do is just offer some concluding remarks. I had this whole dream about asking you guys so many more things, Sharita, Mark, and Aaron, but please follow these extraordinary people. We've posted their social media handles in the chat box so you can follow them. Let me start by saying a huge thank you to you guys. You have been extraordinary panelists. I want to thank the audience for joining and supporting Outright and this movement that is so important. I really want to ask you, if you joined this and, we had a huge response to this conversation, to please stay involved. So we're going to have more webinars on this and other topics. On November 18th, we're going to host a conversation about progress for trans rights in the Caribbean. We have an upcoming global conference called Out Summit, where you'll see this kind of sophisticated conversation looking at the pressing human rights issues of the day. It's December 9th through 11th. If one of my colleagues could post that in the chat box, that'd be great. You can register at outsummit.org. And I can tell you one of our keynote speakers is Hamid Sino, the lead singer of the Lebanese band Mashru Leila. They are visionaries and they are great musicians, so please check it out. And I just want to say, this is the first conversation. It's not the last conversation. our movement has been through so much. And what really inspired me in hearing from you guys today, Sharita, Mark, and Erin, and just seeing how many people stayed on for this whole conversation, is that we are ready for change and we have the answers. So with that, I want to conclude the conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.